Signed, sealed, delivered. Stevie Wonder. He sang last night at this historic nomination acceptance speech of Senator Barack Obama, the first African-American major party presidential candidate. We're joined right now here in Denver in our special broadcast, Breaking with Convention, War, Peace, and the Presidency, from the streets to the suites to the convention floor, by Michael Eric Dyson, professor at Georgetown University, where he teaches theology, English, and African-American studies, also an ordained Baptist minister and author of 16 books, including, well, that's at last count, April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr.'s death and how it changed America. He also wrote Come Hell or High Water, Hurricane Katrina, and The Color of Disaster, as we talk on this third anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. Michael Eric Dyson, it's good to have you with us.
Great to be here with you, Amy.
Well, why don't we start with Dr. King, 45 years ago.
Right.
And then let's talk about what happened last night.
Sure. Well, you know, Martin Luther King Jr. was giving an amazing speech. He had the history of Abraham Lincoln in his background. He had the Lincoln Memorial, of course, there as the backdrop to his speech, and he was quite conscious of trying to make a Lincoln-esque speech. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, for Martin Luther King Jr., it's about a C-plus speech. He's, you know, hitting all the notes, but not feeling the great inspiration. Mahalia Jackson hollers from the sideline, "Tell him about the dream, Martin." And so he puts the paper down and he soars. Black women have often been in the background of tremendous events for which they've never been given credit. But Martin Luther King Jr. was saying some things at the beginning of that speech that have been obscured by the peroration, the dream stuff. He says, "We have come to the nation's capital to cash a check that has been returned to us insufficient funds. I refuse to believe that the great vaults of democracy are empty." He said, "We are marooned on a tiny island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity." All that's obscured. He says Negroes in the South can't vote and Negroes in the North believe they have nothing for which to vote. He went on to say that police brutality was the reality, and the marvelous new militancy which has arisen certainly must not replace white supremacy with black supremacy, but he acknowledged those young people. All of that was in that speech. He said the whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of this nation. I mean, this is tremendous language, but is obscured by the dream element of that speech. But Martin Luther King Jr. articulated a vision that had the possibility of transforming American society because he was trying to make an argument for the vote and for civil rights. John Kennedy was relieved when Martin Luther King Jr. went to the White House immediately after the speech, and he says, "I have a dream too." So he was very wary. You know, there's a great book about John Kennedy and his relationship to civil rights called The Bystander. The title alone suggests that he did as little as possible, any minimal critical effort to really facilitate civil rights in the White House.
You saw in the conversation I had with John Lewis before I was so rudely interrupted by the Denver police, that, well, John Lewis, of course, 45 years ago, when he was honored last night in the first part of the event with Dr. King and King's children, he gave a speech, which was toned down.
Oh, yeah, they vetted that speech. He was going to give a radical speech about the March of Sherman. They said, hey, we got to tone that down a little bit because the old man, A. Philip Randolph, has been imagining this speech for decades, imagining this march for decades. Please, let's not interrupt the broader march here, and let's not forget the bigger picture. So he toned it down. He was the young Turk on the stadium, on the pulpit that day, the rostrum, the podium. Dorothy Height, the female leader, of course, could not even speak. So sexism interrupted the process there. The radical was toned down, and Martin Luther King Jr. was given his 9 minutes. That's what he was assigned to be able to speak that day. And what's interesting, you know, we talk about this generational division between the civil rights generation and Barack Obama's post-civil rights generation. Well, there was a lot of beef between Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young and those guys and Martin Luther King Jr. Roy Wilkins was older. Thurgood Marshall said, wait a minute, we should be doing this in the court. You're taking this to the street. Martin Luther King Jr. was looked at as a young rebel who was doing something that was quite antithetical to the interests of black people, especially as Thurgood Marshall and Wilkins and then NAACP conceived it. So they said, we'll give him the last speech. We'll speak first, Roy Wilkins and Whitney Young, because the camera, I believe it was from CBS, would be there. They'd get captured. Plus, they didn't want to speak after King. But they didn't know that by the time King was about to speak, not only was CBS there, but ABC and NBC joined it because it was such a monumental thing. His 9 minutes got transformed into 19 minutes of pure oratorical genius, especially at the end, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Michael Eric Dyson, fast forward 45 years to the Mile High Stadium, 84,000 people crowd in, making it the largest audience for a nomination acceptance speech in the history of this country, beating out John F. Kennedy at the LA Coliseum, at 80,000. Then, of course, 25 million people watching on television. What about what the substance of Barack Obama had to say?
Well, you know, he had a tough audience, so to speak. He had a tough responsibility because he had been criticized, ironically enough, for being, you know, a soaring orator. You know, fill in the blanks, give it to us. Well, you know, policy wonkish speeches are not necessarily those things that inspire us. So he's got to fill in the blanks. He's got to meet the demand that he give a speech that displays his broad knowledge of the public policy issues that are critical to American future and the expansion of democracy, and at the same time prove his bona fides as an American patriot, and then not be ghettoized in any sense to an African American tradition, but seeing that as a springboard to an American tradition, and plus he's got to inspire. Geez, that's a hard thing to do, and then you got 84,000 people out there, 20,000 can't get in. They come to you 6-mile lines. It was an extraordinary thing, but I think that he was conscious of that historical legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., referred to it at the end, had set it up that John Lewis and Bernice King, the daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., and Martin Luther King Jr. III had participated. So he had the pageantry of the civil rights generation, but he looked toward a kind of future that moved beyond issues of race and class and gender and their negative, pernicious consequences. So it was a very difficult thing he had to do, but I think in many ways a lot of people felt very good about that speech and felt that he delivered.
Overall, was there something you wanted to hear more of, or did this do it for you?
Well, you know, no speech is perfect, and as a minister myself, I know how difficult it is depending upon the inspiration. I used to tell people when I preach at a church, if you want a great sermon, be a great audience. And he had a great audience. I mean, you know, they were enthusiastic, they were ready to hear from him, and I think he did a very difficult thing. He laid out his position. He showed a sharp contrast between him and John McCain, or at least tried to establish that, and tried to get back at John McCain. But look, he's in a difficult position. He's a black man. Are you going to be an angry black man? Are you going to, if he goes after McCain too hard, then he's perceived as a kind of angry black fellow. So he can't really do that. But he has to also articulate his resistance to Mr. McCain's policy, as well as his project for America as a kind of John Wayne gung-ho gunboat guerrilla democracy that begins to play the games of war in ways that have been problematic. So it was a difficult thing to do, but I think he struck his note pretty high.
What about his calling for intensifying the war with Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's it's a very difficult thing to do. I mean, I think as Senator Obama sees it, that Iraq's occupation has nothing to do, and I think it was Senator Biden or Gore, I can't remember, it was Senator Obama, where, you know, occupying Iraq when this is a war that's being prosecuted in 80 different places and countries is not sufficient. So I think that the contrast for him is that Iraq is not the place to be, but the intensification of Afghanistan is, and then many people, of course, are very uncomfortable with that because the intensification of the war in Afghanistan doesn't mean that you're dealing with the source of al-Qaeda anyway, and you're not dealing with the economic and the social suffering and misery that lead to some of the choices that have been destructive in that region.
Last night, Democracy Now! Correspondent